these ideas of the nation states that we have were not based on that. They were based on a Pan-African regime. So it is unfortunate that we're not using the same pathway that we use in terms of political independence for economic independence. We are still working around jurisdictions that we did not design. It is my dream to one day travel from my capital city, Harare, all the way to Bujumbura on a railway made of African steel using a train system that basically allows me the freedom of person, which is moving across the continent.
What is it that is so special about the African Green Mineral Strategy that people should take note of? If you had the ear of the AU chairman, what do you think will be the top recommended actions in thinking around operationalization of the AGMS and the broader conversations we are having around minerals value chains and just energy transition?
From the ground to the grid, Africa has got the resources, but how do we thrive when we do not correctly leverage the vast resources at our disposal? Welcome to Blindspot Africa, the podcast where stakeholders come together to shape the future of Africa's energy and extractive resources. Listen to fresh insight and your dialogue on how inclusive resource governance can be beneficial for all Africans.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Blindspot Africa, where we shine the light on critical issues that are mostly not discussed in issues and areas around extractive governance, climate action, energy transition, and the energy sector in Africa. My name is Charles Demfield from the Africa Center for Energy Policy, and I'm your host for this session, coming to you live from the city of South Africa as we participate in the Investing in Mining Indaba events. Today, we have a very interesting conversation around just transition and critical minerals and value addition in Africa. And with me here is one person who he is the Just Transition Advisor at PowerShift Africa. He's going to tell us more about PowerShift Africa. And he's also doubling as a PhD fellow in the University of Wits in South Africa. I really hope to call him doctor in a few moments to come. So we have our guest, Mr. Kudakwashe Manjonjo, Kuda for short. Kuda, thank you so much.
Hi, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So, PowerShift. What do you do at PowerShift?
We do a lot, but I think that's what everyone says, right? But at PowerShift Africa, we are a think and do tank, which is a very interesting journey where we emphasize the importance of being thought leaders in the climate change space, but then actioning it out through a lot of the civil society networks and movements that we are support of and we work with. We are headquartered in Kenya, but as you can see, all of us are Kenyan. I'm from the beautiful country of Zambezi River between Zambia and Zimbabwe. But we at PowerShift Africa focus on three key elements: financing, adaptation, as well as energy issues around the climate change crisis that we have.
Your name really sounds revolutionary, like the the Amandla kind of vibe. But I like the areas that you are focusing on. So you're not just maybe being a revolutionary power to the people kind of people, but what do you really also look at? How do you advocate? What are the ways within which PowerShift operates?
I think that's for us. That's what makes us interesting in terms of how we do the work. We always Amandla, as you said, always very much power to the people. Yeah. But we believe that power to the people should be evidence-based. We don't say it for the sake of saying it, but there's a reason behind it. The only thing that makes, we think tanks and civil society important in this space is being able to show the concerns and issues of people at hand, but with solutions. So the thinking part for us provides the solution to the issues on the ground. So henceforth, the thinking and doing part, and of course, Amanda will always be the source of our energy and results.
Yeah. So your role as a Just Transitions Advisor, how does it fit within the whole discourse around just transitions in Africa?
Yeah, so I got the fortunate opportunity of joining PowerShift Africa under the Just Transition Work Program. Where in this Just Transition work that we do, the idea is basically how do we show the positive aspects of the work that we're doing against fossil fuel. Of course, as PowerShift Africa, we are strongly against the continued investment in coal, oil, and gas. But that's not good enough, right? At the end of the day, there's 600 plus million people in Africa without electricity, without energy. And it's basically my role to to basically show how we are going to transition from those who have no electricity, and including those who do have electricity but based on fossil fuels, and to build out that dream, that future. That's how I describe it.
Where's that going?
So far, so good. You know, it could be worse, it could be better, but I think so far, so good. I think what's important, and I'll give you an example. Last year, 50 gigawatts worth of solar panels were imported into the continent. And there are two reasons for this. I think policy-wise, there's a genuine acceptance now that Africa's cheapest source of energy will be sun and wind. But secondly, and more importantly, I think the economics are now showing that makes way more sense 1 kilowatt per hour to invest in sun and wind compared to investing in coal, oil, and gas.
Yeah.
So for me, that's really something in the right direction. We still have 600 million people who don't have electricity. So we're not there for sure. We still have a big part of the work to do. However, at least we're now beginning to see our theory change being of genuine practice within the continent.
So I think we need another session to discuss these issues of renewables in Africa. But today, I want us to focus on one thing. I know you're a very serious campaigner. I've heard you on various platforms and on various panels where you are very, very vocal and charismatic around the African Green Mineral Strategy. And I like the way you push that point. I want you to read the African Mineral Strategy. I want you to do this. And I've heard you say that a lot of times. What is it that is so special about the AGMS that people should take note of?
Yeah, so I always define the Africa Green Mineral Strategy as the little cousin of the Africa Mining Vision, which came out in 2009. However, the African Green Mineral Strategy focuses on what are now usually called critical minerals. But the continent, we consider them green minerals because they're minerals that support us with the energy transition on the continent. Why I think this is by far the most revolutionary document currently on the books of the African Union is because it really outlines a lot of the issues that we've been talking about in terms of the value chain that can be developed on the African continent with the resources that we have.
Yeah.
So it's basically a big framework where African countries can come together to build out that. The most interesting part for me, and again, I'll urge people watching this to read the African Green Mineral Strategy. There are 10 value chains that are outlined throughout of it. And of course, the usual suspects such as solar panels, wind. The one that really touches my heart is the steel value chain. At the end of the day, if you want to get electricity into people's houses, we need cables that actually transmit the power. And the steel value chain is the greatest source of actually electrifying those 600 million people that don't have electricity now. So that's why I think the African Green Mineral Strategy is important. It gives us enough pathways for all countries on the continent to be part of the energy transition, but also not individually. It won't work. At the end of the day, we are still working around jurisdictions that we did not design. You know, the borders between some of our countries do not make any sense at all. And I think the Africa Green Mineral Strategy really emphasizes the need for regional integration at best, but also regional cooperation at the very least for these value chains to work out.
Do you think national governments have really come to embrace this? Because you said that it is the cousin of the AMV, the African Mining Vision. But if you really look at the African Mining Vision, we just have about 4 or 5 countries that have ratified the AMV. And AMV has been there since 2009, almost 20 years down the line. And we have 4 countries or 5 countries having ratified that. So we see a lot of bottlenecks in that regard. Now, as a little cousin to AMV, we have the AGMS. What is your view around governments, national governments embracing the AGMS and integrating that into their own national plans and frameworks around green minerals?
Yeah, so there's a reason why I call it a cousin and not child, because it is a strategy. So it's not a binding document, unlike the African Mineral Mining Vision, which of course needs signed signatures and ratification. This would be a lot easier if we ratified the African Minerals Vision. I think we need another 10 countries for this to happen.
Yeah.
So that's why this is a cousin, because it's influenced with the ideals of the African Minerals Vision. So now onto the Green Mineral Strategy and how governments are relating to it. Governments are at least acknowledging the importance of this strategy, which is important. And even more important too, we are seeing countries developing their own mineral strategies. So South Africa, Zambia, Tanzania, off the top of my head, have all developed strategies that are not informed, partially acknowledge the green mineral strategy. So you are seeing alignment. I still do think there's too much of a national focus, especially with certain value chains where you have the mineral crossing borders. So for example, copper is between DRC and Zambia, chrome is between South Africa and Zimbabwe. So the actual borders are unnatural and don't make sense to actually exploiting those resources. I do understand the idea of sovereignty. A lot of our politicians, not a lot, all of them, only get into power based on them being able to take care of that region of the continent. However, in terms of practice, the reality is if there's not enough coordination for certain value chains, you will not be effective. And what actually happens, which is what we see, there are the negative externalities. Investors who basically push us against each other to try give them a better deal rather than us working together to ensure that we have a common force on a common ground as to how we engage those investors.
You're listening to Blindspot Africa. In this podcast, we delve deeper into critical issues of resource governance, including those that may not typically be highlighted in the media. We discuss the facts, figures, challenges, and pathways for Africa to achieve its full wealth potential. We also illuminate strategies on how citizens can demand accountability for resources managed on their behalf. Stay tuned for more insights.
What do you think AMDC should do? I mean, when it comes to Africa establishing regional-based organizations, there are so many. The AU is like our mother or the umbrella body. Underneath, we have AFREC, we have the AMDC, AFDB is looking at the investment side of things. Even at the various sub-regional levels, we have the ECOWAS, the SADC, the COMESA, the Maghreb regions, all, having their own ways of doing things. Within them is the kid on the block, Africa Continental Free Trade Area. How do all of these units really come together to ensure that kind of, national engagement around the operationalization, so to speak, of the AGMS? How do we do that?
I think, first of all, we should remind ourselves, this is the greatest political experiment that's ever been done globally. The EU, from a geographical point of view, is a third the size of African continents. So what we're trying to do is something that no one has ever done. And we should give ourselves grace to explain how difficult this is. Basically, the European Union is, I think, smaller than the Southern Africa Development Community from a geographical point of view. So that's the first thing. We're bringing it, we're built into it. That is so hard to do, but we're on that journey. So, of course, there are a lot of challenges that we're facing in terms of operationalizing a number of these institutions. However, that's not the point. I think the point is their foundations, and every generation has an agenda that it needs to have. I believe that the previous generation, it was their duty to set up these institutions. The upcoming generation is their duty to really operationalize them. And how do we do that? We do that by actually investing in the African Union, doing a lot more deals through the African Union rather than through our national strategy documents and the likes. But that takes a lot of political courage, which I don't think, unfortunately, is within this current generation of our leaders. But hopefully, as we get into those offices like yourself, hopefully you become the president of Ghana one day.
Oh,
you'll be able to do this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to put you on the spot on this one. I have identified that certain trade-offs exist around the whole conversation on value addition. And I think it has taken center stage in the past 2 to 3 years. And it's becoming woven in the thread around mineral development in Africa. Everybody is talking value addition. But one particular trade-off that I identify is the trade-off of speed to market versus domestic capacity building, where it seems the market is not waiting for us. China is not waiting for Africa to develop. US is not waiting for us. We hear the news about US trying to have a pact with 50 countries in providing minerals and all of that. So, and even a challenge that the AGMS actually highlighted as a risk is the potential technology growth that can disrupt, all the things that we are talking about. What if in the next 5 years, there's a new technology that disrupts your lithium, that disrupts your copper. That's new technology that are being mined in the lab, AI taking over and all of that. So we are faced with an issue of speed versus accuracy. Looking at what is happening on the market versus how we build our domestic capacity, how we attract investment, which is becoming quite slow in the region and becoming a challenge. How do we manage this trade-off? And how do we do? What do you think will be a policy way through which this particular trade-off can be managed?
I'm interested in how you define this problem in terms of speed and accuracy. I'd like to add another dimension, which I think the other dimension is how strong is our vision?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we are lacking on the continent. Not speed or accuracy. How strong is our vision? We mentioned the USA's vision under Trump, the Chinese vision under Trump, under
Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, exactly. What is the African vision? I have a colleague of mine, Fidel Kubu, and he's always talking about this, that we have the opportunity to basically build and set up the greatest deal of the century. What we're basically arguing here is, in terms of this deal, is to say there is no speed or accuracy that will happen. If Africa today decided to stop mining at this very point, there is absolutely no energy transition. That's how dominant we are in terms of being a critical resource for a lot of these minerals.
Yeah.
But what is the vision? Informing, doing something that radical, Just like when we saw China and USA fighting, there were visions that informed that. So that third element, besides speed and accuracy, I would add the vision. Because the vision is what will then support the speed or accuracy of whatever you're doing. So in terms of this being the biggest deal of the century, it's up to Africa to literally say to China, we will not export these minerals without A, B, C, D, E, F. We do have the power for that. Do we have the political courage for it? Do we have the reasoning for it? Are we preparing ourselves to ensure that once we demand this, we are prepared in terms of, at least from a policy level, actually yes. This will probably slow down progress in terms of the speed point that you're making. And I do think it would be a lot more accurate to the needs of the African continent.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to realize that a lot of the technological developments that are happening are not meant for people moving out of poverty. And I think that's important. We are so stressed about trying to dominate a market, technology. The 600 million people in Africa don't need the latest form of LED. They need a simple light, They don't need the latest SUV. They need a simple bus to take them from A to B.
Yeah.
So we should encapsulate our vision to focus on the needs of Africa. And what that will do is we won't be stressed about the speed or accuracy because it's now managing what we actually need. And I think that's the most important aspect.
Yeah. Another trade-off we identified is national sufficiency versus regional integration.
Mm-hmm.
Every country wants to build a battery plant. Every country wants to build a refinery. Every country wants to do one thing or the other around, critical minerals, value addition. We see 54 plans, 54 strategies, 54, ways, 54 local content policies that seem to create a certain sense of nationalistic tendencies. However, we see AMDC championing a certain sort of regional integration, regionalization, and all of that. And nationalization has become a barrier to regionalization. How do you remove these barriers? Focusing on ensuring that nations still remain aspirational in their dreams, but how is those dreams subsumed into the bigger objective around regionalization?
I think the greatest fallacy that has happened with this idea of nationalism is as if the Pan-African story was built on nation states. It wasn't. It was built on the African story, ensuring independence in all of these countries. Ghana supported most of the African countries to get their independence. South Africa, at the end of apartheid, was supported by Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Zambia. So even these ideas of the nation states that we have were not based on that. They were based on a Pan-African regime. So it is unfortunate that we're not using the same pathway that we use in terms of political independence for economic independence. And that is what we then need to change.
I like that point, how we are not using what existed in the past. How there's a song about even Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and the musician says we are the nucleus of the great union, Africa's strongest foundation, the foundations of AU and all of that within which this was built. How that fight for political independence, where we actually join forces together, is not being translated in the issues around economic independence. I like the point that you're making.
That's the truth. No, we have to be honest with ourselves. Even when I'm fortunate enough to speak with our governments, I'm like, the reality is we did not gain political independence unilaterally. You know, of course, we do create these narratives and stories. It happens in South Africa, it happens back home in Zimbabwe, where we, at least in South Africa, they call it the rainbow nation, right? In Zimbabwe, we talk about it as the armed struggle, the armed liberation struggle, as if we did it ourselves. But that's not what history says. History says that we combined our workforces, and that's what we need to do with the economic independence. What would that look like? It looks like some countries genuinely sacrificing the national agenda for the international agenda, and that is what is important. I do not think there's going to be a point where there's going to be smooth sailing in any case, but we need one or two countries that are willing to lead that vision. As you may know, usually when you think of the African continent, they're the big five, right? South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt. There's another one I'm forgetting.
Where's Ghana?
No, Nigeria is a bit bigger. You know, but there are 4 or 5 countries that are usually the most attractive in terms of renewable investment. I think those are the ones that can actually lead this. Here at Mining Indaba, I've been engaging with South Africa regulators to say, why has South Africa not ratified the protocol on trade for the Southern African region? It's ridiculous. They control 60% of the economy of the region, but they've not ratified the most important industrialization strategy for the region. So you see the self-interest is actually not feeding into the needs of the region. But if, for example, South Africa signed that document, which allows for greater industrialization linkages between the countries, what will then happen? We are now getting to that economic independence we are hoping.
Maybe my last but one question to you would be, what do you think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the role of that treaty would be for advancing the Africa Green Mineral Strategy?
I'll say it in terms of a dream that I'm always telling people. It is my dream to one day travel from my capital city, Harare, all the way to Bujumbura on a railway made of African steel using a train system that basically allows me the freedom of person, which is moving across the continent, but also making pit stops in all the countries in between for me to do some of my trade deals or my consultancies. That is the dream. So that's what AFCFTA is supposed, how AGMS fits into the free trade agreement. The Green Mineral Strategy is basically the building blocks for us to actually build these economic and infrastructure corridors that will give way to the free trade agreement. For me, the free trade agreement in itself is a vision of what 54 countries look like when they are at least coordinated. But the Green Mineral Strategy are the building blocks to actually build this very real life thing. The steel, the renewable energy, are the different types of economic diversification that will come with the energy transition.
And if you had the ear of, let's say, the AU chairman, who can coordinate all the national programs, what do you think will be the top recommended actions for the person in thinking around operationalization of the AGMS and kind of the broader conversations we are having around minerals value chains and just energy transition?
I would say let's start working on what we have rather than what we hope to have. What we have is a very fully developed steel value chain on the continent. We have steel plants, we have mini plants, we have the iron ore, we know how to build these things, we have the engineers. The whole value chain is there. It's not sexy like solar panels or wind. I totally get that. But that is the one that will ensure that at least the building blocks for electrification of the 600 million people are actually built out. Why I think this is important? Right now, a lot of investors are complaining that we'll build the solar panel, but they're not connected to the grid. Why? Because there's not enough steel being done to produce the transmission. So that would be my push to say that let us focus on the value chain where we are competitive, which is speaking directly to the needs of Africans in this moment where there is a market for it already, and focus on that, and everything else will follow after that.
Kuda, it's never a dull moment
Never at all.
having a conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much
I appreciate it.
for coming. And we are grateful for your thoughts. And as I mentioned, I mean, there are a lot of things that we can discuss beyond minerals, focusing on energy. I love some of the perspectives that you are putting around. And I hope that you join us once again for a better discussion.
Definitely, my brother.
So, viewers, you heard him. I think it's a bowl of wisdom, and coming from a young person like this, it shows that Africa, and we have a future, and I hope that we can harness some of these brains to develop the region as far as critical minerals, as far as our energy sector is concerned. Thank you so much for joining us for this another great edition of the Blindspot Africa. I hope to see you in the next edition. See you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on Blindspot Africa, your platform for insightful discussions on promoting inclusive resource governance across the continent. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave your feedback or reviews. Stay tuned for our next episode.